The category is What the Trans Darling.
Hello, and welcome to What the Trans.
Yes, what the trans?
Ooh, you sounded quite, I don't know what the word is to describe there. What were you going for?
I think I was going for the Fallout 4 Galaxy News Radio thing. I'm not sure, so one for the gamers out there, perhaps. I don't know, let's try and vary our vocal ability. That's not even a word, Ashley. How are you?
I'm alright. I had a very strange experience last night.
Oh, yeah?
Yesterday, I was working on the script and stuff for this, and then at a certain point, I hit a wall and was like, fuck this, I'm going to go and watch Avatar The Last Airbender. Finished that show, and I had a natural urge to find out what happened to the characters after the show ends. So I went on YouTube, and my YouTube now is cultivated to be an escape from the news. I don't really watch left tube political stuff anymore like I used to all the time. It is entirely based on nerdy things like this and watching bands I love play live. So I was watching a video about what happened to Prince Zuko because that's a character that resonated with me. And then an ad cut in from an Israeli government body, which I can only describe as graphic and upsetting. And probably the first time I've ever seen what amounts to state propaganda on YouTube. And I don't want to start a conversation on the Israel-Palestine situation. I think it's pretty clear where you and I will sit in that particular debate. But I do not feel confident to talk about things publicly that I do not know enough about. And I do not know enough about this, even though I have an opinion on it. So I don't want to add my 2 cents on that when it will not be helpful, and so many smarter people online are doing that for me. But I will say is it was really fucking strange, and I don't know where I stand on the idea of state propaganda being on videos about Nickelodeon shows. It was really odd. What do you think?
I mean, for me, I'm kind of not generally on board with state propaganda being anywhere, but then that's me speaking as someone who's not really on board with the concept of the state. But, that's my inner lefty talking. What are we talking about? Inner lefty. I am all lefty.
Yeah, it's very obvious from talking to you for longer than 30 seconds where you are in the political world. And I love that about you because you always know where you are with you. Like that's a good thing, I think. But
I guess there's a lack of ambiguity there. So,
but have you found like yourself stumbling into like state propaganda-y things like this when you're trying to not? And also, why?
Quite. So no, I haven't. But I don't watch a vast amount of YouTube, and the stuff that I do watch on YouTube, I don't know if the ads are targeted or whatever, but it's mostly about. I can't remember. Just like I watched a couple of short YouTube videos this morning, and there were adverts for them. But it's like I just tune adverts out. And in a way I always have, because when I actually used to watch the television on broadcast, which is not something I've done for years either. I would just, here are the adverts, and on goes the mute button kind of thing. So I've just kind of trained myself to not really pay very much attention to it.
Yeah, I'm the same, but the only reason I paid attention was because it had like a crying child in there and explosions and was like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
The only other time I had a what the fuck on a YouTube advert was when, during the London mayoral election, Brian Rose adverts came onto my thing. And Brian Rose is a nightmare, like COVID conspiracist, like... He has been described by friends of mine who are much funnier than me as a Batman villain in real life.
Right.
And that's kind of what his whole campaign was about. He made a whole deal about campaigning openly in the streets during lockdowns, breaking all sorts of laws and stuff. And probably being partially responsible for any number of waves of COVID, probably, considering how many staff he had on. But yeah, YouTube ads are weird and fucked, and I don't like it.
Yeah, it's not good, is it? So during the campaign for the London mayoral election, even though I'm based here in Manchester, I too also got some targeted content about the London mayoral election. And one of them was, our politicians have failed us. And it had a picture of Boris Johnson and Sadiq Khan, who is, of course, the current mayor of London. And I was just like, okay, this is going to be fashy nonsense. Where skip, get ready. As soon as the button comes up to skip ad, it gets pressed. And just as an aside, completely away from YouTube and stuff, this week I had a very interesting, slightly work-related meeting with a pharmacist.
Ooh.
Yes. So a little while ago, I think I mentioned it on the pod at the time in sort of 2019, I want to say, or possibly even 2018, when I was, because this is back when I was still working for Manchester International Festival. I also went off and did some work for and I've got to get this right, the Centre for Postgraduate Pharmacological Education, which is based up at the university here, and as the name suggests, it deals with pharmacology for people who are graduates in the field. And so I helped them with a video resource and was in it, and that has recently dropped. But it's part of a course material for that specifically, so it's not publicly available on YouTube, it is just within this course. So fine, good.
Pharmacy students will be watching your face talk about trans things.
Talking about prescribing for trans people and the challenges and self-medication and blah, blah, blah.
Well, I mean, good for you. I mean, I'm there just watching Avatar: The Last Airbender. You're out there, making shit happen. I think you've won this week. Well done. And...
Well, here's the thing. So obviously I filmed that ages ago, and last week or the end of the week before, when I was going to pick up my prescription, as I so often do, the chap behind the counter just gave me that look. You know that look that people give you, and it's like, I know that person from somewhere. And so he was in the middle of asking me, can you confirm your address? Can you confirm this and that and the other? And then he said, have you ever done any work for the Centre for Postgrad Pharmacology? And I was like, oh, God, yeah, I have. It was ages ago, obviously. But I did recently hear from them to say, hey, it kind of got a bit delayed because COVID. But it's now going to be out there and used as part of the course materials. I was, oh, great, fantastic. So this fella has seen it, and he'd actually been part of the board, the sort of quality assurance group who'd watched it and said, yeah, it's all good. And he said, yeah, I thought it was really great. And can we have a conversation about it and about aspects of the trans experience that we in the pharmacy industry, shall we say, because this was at Boots, right? Can we have a conversation about that? I said, yeah, sure, okay. So we chatted on LinkedIn for a bit, the first time ever that LinkedIn has come in useful. And then we went for a socially distanced coffee the other day, myself and comrade girlfriend and this gentleman from the pharmacy who asked us a bunch of questions, which we answered. And I suspect, again, it's going to be one of those Casablanca things where I think this could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. But yeah, so that was just like a thing that kind of came out of nowhere. But I've made a new friend / contact, and it's always nice when that happens. So yeah, that was part of my week. And also the other exciting thing from this week is that this very morning, as we record this, I got some new glasses, and they're very stylish. And they're better because the prescription has changed. So now I can see, which is definitely a plus for when you're wearing glasses. So
yeah, and for people who, nobody can see this except me.
No.
But for people to get an impression of what Ashley is looking like, she looks like someone who is very kind and knowledgeable.
Thank you very much. My housemate said that I am definitely leaning towards the Evie from The Mummy vibe. And it was like,
yes,
the librarian.
You've got some Rachel Weisz going on, and that is awesome.
I'm okay with this. That's fine. That'll do me. I'm happy with that. Anyway.
This is going to be the shittest name drop ever, but the one time I was walking through Leicester Square once in London, where I live, and Rachel Weisz was walking around doing like the premiere thing. Okay. And gotta say, I'm a straight woman. I like your more masculine-shaped human being varieties, but I've never seen anyone more stunning in my life. Like, she genuinely, I stopped and gasped, just like, is this what a person can look like? I'm sure she had people, but yeah, I mean, she's also a phenomenal actor and has won many awards, and her talent should not be going without saying, but if you've got a style icon out there, you could do worse than Rachel Weisz.
I'm okay with this, and yeah, I guess I should start dressing like a 1920s librarian. I mean, I've got the tweed jacket already. Anyway,
yeah, we've got a lot to get.
We do have a lot.
That's what you're trying to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, dear listeners, we love you, but this is going to be. It's going to be a trick, this episode.
Yeah, we've got a really cool interview with Christine Burns coming up. We've got to split that into 2 parts because we aimed to record for an hour. We ended up recording for 2 because it was just so fascinating. So that is to come. But for now, let's start with what we're going to start with. Not the news.
Not the news, yeah.
Not the news, but it is, and there's a lot of it. So let's just get started.
Okay.
So to start with a brief placeholder, as we need more time to work on this, on the 13th of this month, May 2021, the High Court in Northern Ireland held a judicial review on the legality of requiring a medical diagnosis to gain a gender recognition certificate. The judgment from this case was released very swiftly after the hearing, and the ruling itself stated that the trans woman who brought the case had been partially successful. To boil it down, the judgment said that she had failed to show a medical diagnosis was in conflict with the European Convention of Human Rights, specifically to Article 8, which states a right to a private and family life, home, and their correspondence, but was successful in arguing that proving that she had a medical disorder, keyword disorder, was wrong. As far as we can tell, this means that how the Gender Recognition Act itself on a surface level works will remain unchanged, but applicants will probably no longer have to prove that they have a disorder, and will probably have to prove that they have a medical condition of gender dysphoria or gender incongruence. Which, I mean, disorder's a shittier word, a more humiliating word, but essentially, functionally, you change it around, it sort of means the same thing as gender dysphoria and gender incongruence, kind of. There will be another hearing down the line for the courts to hash out what changes need to be made to the Act itself, and we will keep you in the loop on that, but there is another wrinkle that we need more time to work on. In the judgment itself, the government claimed as evidence that they were planning to reform the Gender Recognition Act by removing a need for a medical diagnosis. In the judgment, they specifically referred to advice given by the government's LGBT health advisor, Dr. Michael Brady, as a reason why the government, quote-unquote, changed their mind. Now, this flies in the face of everything that has been shown by this government, but let's leave that to one side for a second. Pink News were the first to report this, and this did cause some concern in the community as the story appeared to be pointing at Dr. Michael Brady's advice to the government as the reason why the government changed their mind on reforming the GRA and subsequently binning it last year. We need more time to look into this angle as something feels really weird about this. Dr. Michael Brady has a long history as an advocate for demedicalising the process. Many people reached out to me with personal experiences from knowing Dr. Michael Brady when I first tweeted this out, and they were saying this feels weird considering what we know about him. And subsequently, after the report from Pink News came out, Dr. Michael Brady did release a statement through the NHS saying this story is incredibly misleading and misrepresents Dr. Brady's advice, which was that gender dysphoria is acceptable wording if the Gender Recognition Act requires a medical diagnosis. Dr. Brady's opinion is that in line with the majority of respondents to the government's consultation on Gender Reform Act, the process for requiring a gender recognition certificate should be as seamless and barrier-free as possible. And he went on to tweet, I agree with the majority of respondents to the GRA consultation that the requirement for a gender dysphoria diagnosis, a medical report, evidence of living in a true gender for 2 years, and spousal veto should be removed from the process. The statements attributed to me that were reported today are misleading and misrepresent my advice. The GRC process should be demedicalised, simplified, and barrier-free. So that was what Dr. Brady had to say about the situation. And one thing that should be taken into account is that the government, based on their history, haven't been the most on the level in the past about what their intentions are for GRA reform, as we have reported on extensively. Saying that the report by Pink News does not include anything that could be said to be inaccurate or misleading. So basically, we have no fucking idea what the hell is going on here, but we hope to have something on this more concrete for you on next week's podcast.
Yes, indeed.
I don't think there's really any place for us to discuss this in any depth because honestly, I don't know enough. I definitely tweeted this out too fast. I should have really done a bit more checking on this, but yeah, there's not really a lot more that can be said right now. Let's just move on to the next thing, right?
We shall move on.
So moving on to something that we can actually talk about with more insight and concrete stuff to go on. Here's something that is really cool. The LGBT Consortium, an organisation that connects and supports a huge number of LGBT organisations, has released an open letter to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Going forward, we will refer to them as EHRC because those are too many syllables. Where they call out the EHRC on their failure to support the LGBT community and specifically the trans community. The EHRC is supposedly an independent public body who are responsible for implementing the Equality Act, which protects us all, but specifically includes protections for trans people under the words gender reassignment. However, in recent years, they have been more likely to do very little for LGBT people. The letter, which was signed by representatives from 38 LGBT organisations, including Stonewall, Mermaids, Gendered Intelligence, Transactual, the LGBT Foundation, and many others, had this to say. As leaders of trans and LGBTQ plus organisations, we are writing to express our frustration and disappointment at the Equality and Human Rights Commission's recent record on LGBTQ plus people's rights and trans people's rights specifically. The letter goes on to end saying, we urge the EHRC to engage with our communities and review how the EHRC can truly play an effective role in making our human rights a reality. As leaders of trans and LGBTQ plus organisations, we want to see a strategic programme of activity to support our communities and address the inequities we experience in healthcare, at work, at school, within homelessness, and in our communities. Trust can only be rebuilt with effective action and good community engagement. This letter comes as the new chairperson of the EHRC, Kishwa Faulkner, gave an interview to The Times where she talked about protecting the rights of people who hold transphobic views, which she made a point of calling reasonable, whilst failing to mention any of the considerable problems trans people face and the widespread actual breaking of equalities law when it comes to transgender people, which certainly inspires massive fucking questions from us concerning her focus on equality. There is every chance she did mention to the journalist issues facing transgender people and they just didn't go in, but I have an inkling that that wasn't necessarily a thing that happened, because the EHRC themselves shared the article on social media and she shared it herself on her personal social media account, so they clearly signed off on the message that was being said in this article, that the EHRC's focus is not on protecting trans people and making sure the law is being followed when it comes to combating discrimination, but on cases such as Maya Forstater, a cis woman who is currently waiting to see if her appeal against her former employer, who chose not to renew her contract due to the endless anti-trans hate she spews online. It would appear that the focus is more on protecting the right of cis people to be transphobic rather than doing anything to help trans people in employment or any other area of equalities law. Now, the EHRC intervened in the case of Maya Forstater, arguing that her views are protected, but currently we have seen very little signs that they care at all about anything relating to the widespread discrimination being faced by us right now. And the letter from the LGBT consortium signed by 38 LGBT organisations shows that we are not the only ones by far who believe this to be the case. Ashley, what's your take on the EHRC and also on this letter?
Well, the letter's great, isn't it? And it says precisely what it needs to, and you kind of hope that people in the EHRC are reading it and going, oh, okay. But it's more likely that the people in the EHRC who've been installed there under the government of racist liar and current Prime Minister Boris Johnson are not really concerned with actually advancing equality. That's kind of how it seems to me. It seems like that they are, just fall guys, yes men, cat's paws, call it however you like, but people who've been installed in high up places who have no intention whatsoever of carrying out what the ministry or what the organisation is actually responsible for. Particularly in the case of the new head of the EHRC, where she gets installed in the position and the first thing she does is interviews with The Times, famously not a paper that is balanced and fair and equitable when it comes to LGBT and specifically trans people, and says, transphobic views are perfectly reasonable and should be protected. So,
yeah, I should point out she didn't say the words transphobic views are reasonable. She said gender critical views are reasonable. I mean,
that's the same thing as far as I'm concerned.
I know, right?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult to separate quote unquote gender critical views from just outright transphobia. And the reason it's very difficult is because they're the same thing.
Yeah.
So
it's just nicer words for it. That's just all it is. And I think the rot has been set in the EHRC far longer than Boris Johnson's administration. There are people that have been put in place there, even by allies or on the surface allies, like former Minister for Women and Equality's Penny Mordaunt, who made additions to the board of people who, let's just say, their personal output onto the social media world has not been encouraging. I think that this has been a long-term placing people with really weird takes on equality onto the board, and that is filtering down. And you see the focus of this with the EHRC's sort of support of government ideas like there is no racial discrimination, institutional discrimination in the UK, and things like that. Like, they seem to be towing the line that they are looking at the equality of people who don't necessarily have as much of an urgent need for reform as certain other minorities, which is
I mean, the EHRC is supposed to be there to be a force for equality and human rights, and what they're actually doing is focusing on the, quote-unquote equality of people that have already got it. White, cis people who've got money to bring court cases, essentially. That's what their focus is on, because that's the higher-ups in the government and the EHRC are thinking, oh, well, those are our sort of people, not like those, not like the other people who are different from us, people who are trans or who have a different skin colour kind of thing. It's just, it could be so much better than it is, and it isn't, and it's just so frustrating.
Yeah, whilst sort of looking into this, I had a number of conversations with solicitors and barristers, but these come under the deep background thing, and in journo terms, that basically means cannot be attributed to the person,
Indeed.
Cannot really be directly utilised. It's sort of like as it says, deep background, but the impression, I basically asked some very pointed questions and got this kind of answer that is, it's possible. But I think that there is a major case here in taking the EHRC to a judicial review to judge the lawfulness of their focus on these issues, because I've looked through a bunch of meeting minutes and looked through as much as I can on what the EHRC has actually done for trans people, and it is shockingly very little to nothing. Not even going so far as like handing out leaflets reminding employers that it is illegal to block trans people from a job because they're trans, which there's a thing 3 years ago saying, polled by Crossland's employment solicitors of employers saying 1 in 3 UK employers will not employ a trans person because they're trans, which is just them admitting to potentially breaking the law. That's what that is. And the EHRC has done nothing on that. So I'm thinking there may be a case here for someone out there with cash to spend. Hello, Good Law Project. To take the EHRC to task about this in a judicial review. I don't know how else we could maybe even get the EHRC to act on this, because they're not going to respond to protests or anything, I don't think. I think the only place we could even begin to fight this is in the courts, but I could be wrong. But it's not an uninformed opinion. I did ask people that know things, and they were sort of like, yeah, it's possible. It would be hard, but not impossible.
Yeah, I mean, it's the power imbalance, isn't it? And that's the problem that, like, activists and other people that are trying to, fight for a better world are constantly up against, is the fact that, we are small and there's maybe not very many of us and we don't have very much money, and the people that are in charge don't even listen to us because they don't have to, and it's just, it's an uphill struggle, isn't it? And obviously this is something that's been the case for a long time, as Christine Burns' interview will allude to later. Anyway, shall we move on?
Yeah, I got another big important thing. Last week has been just full of things. Ashley, take it away.
I will indeed. So next up, some news which may be a surprise to some of our listeners, but almost certainly isn't for some others. So obviously we all know that access to trans healthcare on the NHS is an inconsistent and badly organised mess, and the COVID pandemic has added a new layer of fuckery to an already broken system. However, in a story broken by our chums at Pink News, UK gender clinics are not currently referring any trans men forward for bottom surgery, a procedure known as a phalloplasty. Like most trans-affirming surgeries, a phalloplasty is considered an elective procedure, and on April 27th, 2021, current Health Secretary Matt Hancock announced that the elective procedures of all kinds could recommence the following day after a lengthy hiatus due to the pandemic. But the only clinic that provides this treatment in the UK, the St. Peter's Clinic in London, has not resumed the operations and has no date for when this will recommence. Now, this is down to the fact that St. Peter's is not itself a surgical facility and had a contract to refer trans patients to a hospital for the operation to take place, and at the moment they have not secured a contract with another hospital where the procedure can be carried out. Now, when St. Peter's were given this contract to provide the service, it was stated that they would do so until at least 2027, but it is now out for tender once again, which means that the NHS are seeking bids from other providers to carry out the surgery. When St. Peter's were granted the contract in 2019, they did so against no competition. They were the only ones to submit a bid to provide the service. Now, because this tendering process currently being underway, St. Peter's were not able to comment directly on the situation, but they did issue a press release on May the 13th, which read, in part, "We understand that there is a good deal of speculation on social media about current contract negotiations, and we do understand the anxiety that this will be causing to our patients. It had been suggested to us that we would enhance our service by centralising it on a single site, and on exploring this option, it was clear that it would enable us to increase our surgical capacity, as well as improving the patient experience with a more joined-up service. So there's, part of their rationale is explained there, but they go on to say that by wanting to improve the service, that required a renegotiation of all of the contracts involved, hence the tendering process is currently underway again. However, as their own statement alluded to, the anxiety that this limbo status can induce in patients is considerable. Now, we spoke to a trans man who is waiting for this procedure. He spoke to us on condition of anonymity, and he followed us with the following written statement. About a month ago, I saw on Facebook that someone's GIC doctor had told them that St. Peter's were no longer commissioned by NHS England to offer phalloplasty. As someone who has had the stage 1 phalloplasty and is waiting for the second stage, that was terrifying. Would I be left with a partly constructed penis in addition to a vagina and my T-dick? With no access to getting my phalloplasty finished on the NHS, I've been able to just about cope with it for 18 months, but being like this forever is inconceivable. I contacted NHS Central Commissioning and got no reply. I followed up 2 weeks later with the NHS and also emailed St. Peter's, and they both sent me back a "we'll be in touch with some information soon" email. Then, someone showed me a copy of an email from NHS England, and it really clearly said that they had decided not to commission St. Peter's. It was reassuring that the email stated that they are in the process of commissioning a different provider, so I was confused when I got a call from St. Peter's to tell me they're renegotiating a contract, it's normal, it's going well. And when I questioned it, I was told not to believe everything I read online. There's such a power imbalance there that I couldn't risk challenging them on the phone, and that's why I'm writing this instead of coming to talk to Michelle and Ashley on the podcast. If they were to get recommissioned, it would be so easy for my name to mysteriously be missed off a waiting list, or to not be offered that last-minute appointment. The power imbalance is huge, and that's something that's been created as a result of NHS England having only ever commissioned one provider. I felt like I'd been lied to. I knew I'd been lied to. When I was finally sent a letter by St. Peter's, it was the first honest and open communication I'd had through an official channel. They've admitted that they are not currently commissioned and might not get recommissioned. Not everybody on the waiting list has received the letter, just the people that contacted them to find out. Most people are finding the information through social media or through word of mouth. There's probably lots of people who still don't know that there's even an issue. I don't understand why the NHS haven't written to all of the patients on the list. If they had, it would have reduced the impact that this situation is having on people's mental health. So there's quite a lot in this story, and contracts and renegotiations, but the upshot of it is there is at the moment, a delay of unknown time parameters where nobody is being referred forward for the phalloplasty procedure.
There's a couple of things here that I think need pointing out. For a start, this guy was not the only person who mentioned a fear of speaking out on this publicly, which is why I had to go to the States for a very brief interview with Tat Bellamy Walker, which we're going to get to shortly, to discuss the needs of transmasculine people when it comes to bottom surgery in general. And that there tells a story of people whose healthcare is being withheld from them for very, very bureaucratic reasons, but they are not feeling safe to act on it by talking to the quote-unquote press, which this podcast is. It's a tiny, tiny part of the press, but we are very much trying to be a local outlet for the trans community in the UK, so we count, and they're terrified of even speaking to us on this publicly, which is something. But the other thing is, and I've got to say, I cannot shake the feeling that if this was about trans women's surgeries, that there would right now be trans people camped outside of NHS England protesting this every day. And this shows the real side of trans masculine visibility in our own community that we should maybe try and learn from and act on, because it wasn't a surprise that this didn't become like the big thing that people were talking about when it broke inside the community. It wasn't a surprise to me at all, even though I know it would be if it was a trans feminine style procedure. So there's a lot to learn from this, but also the big takeaway from the anonymous person who spoke to us today is there are people who are in limbo when they're halfway through their treatment.
Exactly.
They don't know when it's going to finish. And I guess that's got to be a nightmare situation to be in. I mean, I can't imagine it because I've not been in any part of the surgical pathway myself as a trans person as yet. I hope to one day, but my heart is fucking breaking for the people affected. And if you are affected by this, I will be including a bunch of support links in the description. Transactual have done a tweet where they're saying they're setting up a support group online of some kind. I will put all the information for that and others that I know about in the description.
But it's not good. And, as I mentioned at the start of the segment, it's a system which is just so inconsistent. And I know that what they've said is that they're trying to make things better, and that is all to the good, but it's this lack of communication that's the problem, and this is always the problem so often. And as I've been reading into this, obviously there is only this one provider of bottom surgery for trans men, whereas there are 2 or 3 for trans women. And it's like, again, why is that the case? Why is it only one place for trans men, but actually trans women can go to 2 or 3 different places? Something seems to have gone a bit wrong there. And again, it's because trans men are so often left out of the conversation, invisibilized, even within our own community when we're talking about it. So it's just so frustrating.
Yeah, to get the voice that explains exactly how important these surgeries are for people who are listening who may not consider them as important for whatever reason. I reached out to a bunch of people in the UK first, and there was a lot of hesitance for the reasons that I think anonymous trans man who talked to us pointed out. So I had to go to the States and find some people in the journalism world in the States that I have contact with, and I was referred to Tat Bellamy Walker, who is a reporter for Gay City News based in New York City. And here is our chat talking about the importance of these surgeries. Hello, Tat Bellamy Walker. Thank you so much for coming on the pod and talking about this stuff today. How's it going?
Hey, it's going good. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
It's all good. So I briefly filled you in what the situation is in regards to phalloplasty and bottom surgeries for trans guys in general on the NHS before we started recording. And we wanted to talk to some trans men type people about how important these kinds of surgeries are.
Right.
But we've had some trouble finding people in the UK willing to talk on this, just in case there are repercussions on getting access to this healthcare down the line, which is why we've reached out to you in the States, in New York City, to talk on this. So can you give an outline on how important these surgeries are when it comes to transmasculine people's sense of well-being, their sense of health, mental health and physical health?
I think there's like a big stereotype within the community and just in general that trans men do not want bottom surgery, or that's something that they won't want first or so. And I also believe that sometimes it could seem very out of reach, like bottom surgery can seem just very out of reach for many trans gender men. And in my experience, it's just it's something that I needed in order to just feel a lot just better within my body. And it just becomes very difficult sometimes because there is this perception of how someone's bottom area should look. And there's just a lot of stereotypes with phalloplasty and how penises should look in general. So sometimes there is just a lot of, I don't know, there's just a lot of stigma associated with bottom surgery, but it is very beneficial. And in my case, it was very beneficial for my mental health.
If there was some way that you would want to explain to, I guess, your trans feminine type people who may not be fully aware on the ins and outs of this, would you describe those kind of surgeries as life-saving?
Yes. I would describe these surgeries as life-saving. For me, I definitely recall just having a lot of suicidal thoughts before I had bottom surgery, because it was just something, there were just this really big disconnect there that I was experiencing. So for me, it made me feel more aligned and more affirmed. Yeah, for me, it was definitely life-saving.
What was the biggest marked difference between before you had your surgery and after you had surgery, which I should point out wasn't phalloplasty, it was something else. But what was the biggest difference between before and after?
I mean, I'm going to be honest, I definitely still deal with dysphoria like I still do deal with like bottom dysphoria. That is like still very present. But I think what is different is that it's not as bad as it was before. Like it was just very, very constant before. And I just feel like things just look the way that my mind had always like imagined it to look, or at least as close as it can get with the surgeries that are available. So I think that has been like the biggest difference for me. It's just like getting a little bit closer to how I imagined like my bottom area looking from the time that I was like young. So it's a little closer, not completely there. And, you know, I don't know if I'll get phalloplasty in the future because I have went on consultations for phalloplasty. But definitely I'm definitely a lot more at ease when I see myself in the mirror.
Yeah, there's an old adage that floats around the UK trans community, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't necessarily be true in the States, is that it's like HRT for transmasculine people, very effective and very cool. Bottom surgeries,
Yeah.
not quite there in regards to alleviating dysphoria, but still
It's
very
not.
significant.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's like important to like note, like it definitely isn't completely there in terms of like, you know, making everything like exactly how, you know, in my case, exactly how I imagined. But I would say that there is a huge difference, like from what I had before to now. There's a huge difference. And plus, I think what's really cool about having bottom surgery is that you can really like customize it in a way. I mean, that probably just sounds weird, but you could really like customize it. And even with phalloplasty, like I'm on a lot of these different groups, and you can like, you know, select what types of procedures you want and what types of procedures you do not want. And I think that's a really big deal too. Because I feel like a lot of people think they have to, like, if they get like a metodioplasty or if they get a phalloplasty, they have to get like, you know, they have to get the urethra lengthening. They have to, which is like when they put like a urethra at the top of like the new phallus and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, or you have to get a vaginectomy, or you have to get scrotoplasty. Like, you don't have to get any of those things, or you can get one and not get the other. And I think that's also really cool about having like bottom surgery, is that you can really like have something that you desire and stuff. Like for me, like in my case, it's just like I wanted some of the procedures, but I didn't want all of the procedures. Because then for me, I feel like if I had gotten like every single procedure, I probably would not be like happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's also important. Like people are allowed to have agency in what procedures they want with bottom surgery.
Thank you so much for your time, and have a good week.
Yes, you too. All right. Thank you.
All right, so that's as much as we can say on that one, so we shall now move on. And more news, and God, is this ever going to end? So according to a story published by, of all people, The Telegraph on the 15th of May, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government are going to force new buildings to include separate toilets for men and women, and amending existing unisex toilets to separate them internally based on sex. Now, again, we're taking this with a whole truckload of salt because it is The Telegraph and they have been known to be misleading before, but the report states, Robert Jenrick, the Community Secretary, is to amend building regulations and planning guidance to ensure separate ladies' and gents' facilities are installed in new buildings or those being developed, The Telegraph can disclose. Buildings which already had unisex lavatories, which are shared by men and women, also face having to install partitions to ensure the privacy of the occupants is fully respected, sources said. And we shall come back to that.
Yeah, we fucking will. Jesus.
So this appears to be coming from a consultation that was launched in January titled Toilet Provision for Men and Women, which was of course heavily taken up by the anti-trans nightmare movement based on their various public online communications. It's hard to read this as anything but a direct attack on non-binary people's ability to use public toilets. Seeing as this has come from unnamed sources, we would absolutely advise caution, as the Telegraph has proven countless times they will go with news that sells rather than what is entirely true. But judging by the wording of the initial call for evidence to this consultation, we can see that this very much being the case. Now, here's a quote from the call for evidence. In recent years, there has been a trend towards the removal of well-established male-only, female-only spaces when premises are built or refurbished, and they have often been replaced with gender-neutral toilets. This places women at a significant disadvantage. While men can use both cubicles and urinals, women can only use the former, and women also need safe spaces given their particular health and sanitary needs. For example, women who are menstruating, pregnant, or at menopause may need to use the toilet more often. Now, we think you may agree that this shows a certain slant against the idea of catering to non-binary people and indeed to the wider trans community. But right now, neither Community Secretary Robert Jenrick nor the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government have released any official announcements or anything relating to the consultation, so we will have to wait and see if the Telegraph are on the money or not, and we will let you know as soon as anything concrete comes out publicly. Now, the organisation that I work for did submit to this call for evidence. There are so many calls for evidence at the moment. It seems to be the majority of my working life is writing up responses to these things. And some of the questions seemed a little bit leading, although I must say I have seen worse. And so this is, a consultation that's happening. It is definitely a thing. Whether the Telegraph are reporting correctly or not remains to be seen. I am inclined to think / desperately hope that they are not. They are just putting this stuff out there because they know nobody can do anything even if they're lying. But this is, again, it's part of this wave of attacks on the very identity of trans people and definitely on the ability of trans people and specifically non-binary people to participate in public life. It's like, what are we, Tennessee?
Yeah, it's troubling. So when this first came out, this call for evidence on this consultation, I was talking to some friends of mine, some people I know, and one person said that the call for evidence language was incredibly troubling as a non-binary person. It was full of all of these things like, essentially focusing on how women seem to be the only people who have sanitary needs and other areas like that, which were very much red flags. And at the time, I said, well, let's wait and see. It does look worrying, but it could just be written out of some kind of ignorance. It may not be a mission statement. And as per usual, I was horribly wrong by the sounds of things. But again, it's like you said, there is nothing concrete on this yet except for unnamed sources from the Telegraph, which who the hell is that? It could be, and anyone who's followed this podcast or any news outlet for that matter knows what unnamed sources under this government say and what actually happens after can be totally different. But judging by this, it's pretty safe to say that non-binary people should probably be concerned about this and ready for when the regulations and when the information is made more public to fucking fight, I think, and trans people in general.
I was going to say that, but also it's really, unisex toilet access is not just about trans and non-binary people's access. There are a whole host of situations where it's appropriate to have a unisex toilet. Like when I worked for the clinical research organisation that I did, all of the toilets were gender neutral, but they weren't even cubicles. It wasn't one big room with cubicles in it. They were all small rooms, one toilet, a lockable door, a sink, and everything's in there. So it's kind of privacy in design. But there's a thing called line equity. So certainly in older buildings, there are more gents' toilets than there are women's toilets, because when some of these buildings were built, women weren't allowed in them, essentially, and so they've been converted subsequently. There's usually more toilet facilities for men, which is why there's always a queue. So frequently women have to queue for the toilet because, it can often take longer in there, get your clothes off, sit down. Well, not all of your clothes, obviously. Not getting naked to go to the toilet.
There's been a big argument because I'm going to basically divide the human race into two groups of sit-downs and stand-ups. Mm-hmm. It's not that simple, but for the ease of communicating what I need to say, I'm going to do that. It takes sit-down people like 3 times as long to go for a pee than it does stand-ups.
Yeah.
It's because there's so much more involved in the process biologically, and also clothing choices and all these other things factor in. So there's an argument that needs to be more of a provision for the people that need to sit down more than the people that have the option of standing up. Well, I think the best way to summarize it is prepare for the worst, hope for the best. And there's always, in everything that we've ever done, everything I've looked into, there was always a wrinkle to things, and the Telegraph definitely have a motivation to paint this as bad for the trans community as possible to get clicks. But again, it could well be. So prepare for that, and we'll keep you in the loop on this as it develops. But the final bit of news we have, let me just have a look at the sheet again. We got Caitlyn Jenner's California governor campaign. Should we go into that at all?
No, we shouldn't. She's an awful nightmare person and can fuck off.
All right, on to the meat.
Yeah, so this week is part 1 of our interview with Christine Burns, who is, in the UK, she is something of a trans rights campaigning legend. Now, for those of you who might be unaware, Burns has been involved in many, many different forms with the fight for trans equality for about 30 years. And she was a key figure in Press for Change, a pressure group that was fundamental in advancing legal equality for trans people. They were active all through the 1990s and played a key role in campaigning for the Gender Recognition Act. Now, in recent years, she has stepped into the role of a historian, making sure that this history doesn't get lost in time, as so much trans history already has. So she's written several books on the subject, most recently Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows, which is an anthology of stories written by herself and several other key figures in the trans movement. And she's also written Pressing Matters Volumes 1 and 2, which chronicle the history of Press for Change itself. So part 2 of the interview will be out next week, but for now, here is part 1. Christine Burns, welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me on.
Our pleasure. Thank you for agreeing to speak to us. And I guess let's just get straight into it. Obviously, you've been active within terms of human rights, transgender rights for quite a long time. But to start at the beginning-ish, what led you to form Press for Change back in 1992?
Well, I wasn't there at the birth. I didn't form it. I came along about a year later. It was really formed by about half a dozen people, some of who stayed for the ride, like Stephen and Alex, Stephen Whittle and Alex Wynnham, and Stephen's partner at the time, Sarah Rutherford. Some others dropped out afterwards because they had other things they wanted to do. But the story behind it was you have to go back into the early 80s and to a trans man called Mark Reese. And Mark had transitioned at the beginning of the 70s, and he'd come up against all the barriers that existed because of our documentation. He couldn't change his birth certificate. That meant on a number of grounds he wanted to train as a priest, and that wasn't allowed because in those days the church saw him as being a woman, and of course there were no female priests in those days, so his vocation was blocked off to him. He couldn't marry a woman, which is what he would have preferred to do, because again the state saw him as a woman, and even though in his European court case, the state actually had the gall to say that he wasn't being denied the opportunity to marry because he could marry a man. They actually said at the time that Section 28 was about to happen, they were advocating for the fact that two men could live together, marry and live together. It was really strange. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Mark got help from the NGO Liberty, and he put together a case which he took all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights and arrived there in about 1986. And he had very good, strong evidence of the detriments that he suffered because of his inability to change that one document about him, his birth certificate. He lost. But the point was he started a conversation. And then about 3 years later, a trans woman called Caroline Cossey, who's a model and a TV hostess, and she took an almost identical case in terms of the facts to the European Court of Human Rights. And already the numbers had shifted. She didn't win, but it's one of these things where, you know, it was clear that there was already a shift taking place in the European Court. And prior to that, I think we had all seen the situation we were in as being hopeless, because you couldn't go to the press to say this is unjust, because the press were only interested in what they could do with us in the Sunday tabloids as titillation. You couldn't go to MPs because there's no votes in supporting what, you know, were seen as weirdos. So where do you begin? And what Mark and Caroline's cases had done was to really underline that this is a forum where you can actually take the facts. And the wonderful thing about courts at all levels is that they don't do fake news. They're not interested in the histrionics. And so if your case was strong on the facts, then you had a really good chance of winning. And it was clear from the change in just 3 or 4 years that things were already shifting, not just in Britain, but in Europe. In fact, in 1992, a French trans man won a case against France in the same court, based on slightly different facts. But the point was that the court was willing to entertain that, you know, there could be human rights violations of trans people. So, I mean, in part, this helped to motivate Stephen Whittle to become a lawyer, to study the law first and then take that forwards. It also showed that there was an avenue we could pursue using what's called strategic litigation. That is, you pick your cases so that their facts will, if you're successful, advance your position in terms of politics. And of course, if we were to win in a place like the European Court of Human Rights, then the government would have to do something. So you sort of leap straight over the press, you leap straight over prejudice and get down to, you know, we need to do something about the law. So that was a powerful instrument. And one of the other things that come out of Mark Reese's case was that he got to know an MP called Alex Carlisle, who at the time was the Home Affairs spokesman for the Liberal Democrats, or were they the Liberals? And I'm not sure. So he said, "Come and meet me in my rooms at Westminster." And Mark brought along his friends, people like Stephen and Alex and Sarah, and as I say, a couple more. And it was in that meeting that Alex Carlisle said, "You know, I think you've got a just case, but you are going to have to work for this. One of the things you're going to have to do is to set up a campaign to get your message out there and to organise other, you know, legal cases like this. It's not going to be quick. It'll probably take you about 10 years, but that's the way to go, and I'll support you." So they all repaired to a tea shop across the road called Grandma Lee's, and they were sitting around saying, you know, okay, well, we need to set this organisation up. How is it going to work? What is it going to be called? And the consensus was at the time that, you know, there were things that you shouldn't call it. You shouldn't have trans in the title. You shouldn't have sex in the title or whatever. And people said, well, you know, we certainly want the press to change. We are pressing for change. Why don't we call it Press for Change? And that's actually how it started. And that was on the 27th of February, 1992. So next February, at the end of LGBT History Month, will be the 30th anniversary of Press for Change being set up. But in the meantime, there are other things going on, and I kept bumping into Stephen because I'd been introduced to the international conference circuit by somebody else. And I met him at a conference in Amsterdam in 1993, which was actually because of the European Court of Human Rights cases. It was set up by the Council of Europe, who sort of own the European Court. And then a little bit later that year, I was attending a what was then called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, what's now WPATH, in New York. And again, we bumped into each other. And so when I got back from America, Stephen got in touch. He said, would you like to join this group we've set up? And I said, well, yeah, I'll have a look. And so that's actually how I got invited to take part. And I think I was looking for what to do within that, because obviously there was no clear structure to press for change at the time. And I had also just got involved with grassroots activism in, wait for this, the Conservative Party. Because during the 1992 election, I'd had a falling out with my boyfriend because he was taking the piss over my naive politics. And he was right, actually. When I got back, I found a note through the door from the local Conservatives saying, could you help us? So I got in touch with them and I said, well, yeah, I've got computers in my house, I've got laser printers, I've got faxes. Yeah, I'm sure I can help. So I got involved with them. And by a really strange course of events, I suddenly became the secretary of the branch of the in the constituency of the man who went on to become the chief whip. So that gave me
in the
credit.
Conservative government in the early 90s, yeah?
In John Major's 1992 government. So that gave me tremendous access, because I don't know if you know, if you write, you can only write to your own MP normally, and if you do that, you will get no further really than your MP. If you're lucky enough to have a senior minister or the chief whip as your MP, then actually your letter can be funneled straight through to the relevant Secretary of State and you get a proper answer. So I had a grand old time for about 2 or 3 years at the beginning of the 90s, constructing these letters that were challenging policy and getting them to think about things. And I remember, oh goodness, it's about to go out of my head, the man who was the Home Secretary at the time. God, I've forgotten his name. It'll come back to me in a bit. But I actually cornered him in somebody's house with a tray of smoked salmon sandwiches and said, look, this business with transsexuals has got, it's got to be sorted out. It's not working. Oh, said Michael Howard. And it was
Michael Howard?
Howard, yes.
Okay, that's peculiar. I wasn't expecting that.
Something of the night, Michael Howard.
Yeah, I mean, I did have a question because whilst I was looking up some stuff, I saw I think on the Wikipedia you said something like, I got to a point where I've realised it was more embarrassing to admit I was a conservative than a trans person. I don't know if that was the exact quote, but it was something like that.
Yeah, I've been dining out on that joke for nearly 30 years now. It came to that point in 1997. Yeah, and I don't know if you remember, that was the Conservatives were absolutely mired in sleaze, a bit like now, but actually, by comparison, I think then was quite charming. Now is just plain criminal. But yeah, I found that although part of my social circle was involved with local conservative activism, and yeah, I had this wonderful access to lobby secretaries of state. I realized that I couldn't go on associating with these people. And my dirty little secret is that on election night in May 1997, even though I was at that time both the treasurer and the vice chair of the local Conservative branch, I voted for Tony Blair. So yes, I've had a coloured history as far as politics is concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's it's always something to be aware of. Always beware of a woman brandishing a tray of salmon sandwiches. Always be wary.
He could not escape.
No.
I had been stalking him all night. It was a Friday evening in the constituency, and I just I seized my moment with this enormous tray in my hands and sort of guided him into a corner.
Nice.
So he couldn't run away.
You blockaded him. I like it. I approve. Well, so thank you for that. I think we'll press on with the next section. So we've talked about how you ended up getting involved with Press for Change, but what was your focus within that organisation?
Well, as I say, my first focus, because I was looking for something to distinguish myself as being, a useful member of the group. And in those days, this was before everybody knew about the World Wide Web. Very few people had email. But as these things came along, and because my day job was as an IT consultant, I got into these things quite early. And I was saying to my colleagues, look, this is going to be a very powerful tool for us, because our problem as a little organization was that if we wanted to talk to our membership and grow and be able to say that we were representative of trans people as far as we could see, was that it was incredibly expensive and cumbersome to communicate. We could have articles in the magazines of the support groups like the Gender Trust. We could meet people at conferences like the Gendis conference that was organised every couple of years. And we had a newsletter, but doing the newsletter meant somebody had to write it, then it had to be printed, then it had to be folded, then it had to be stuffed into envelopes. We had about 1,000 people we could send to, but first class postage, well, even second class postage to 1,000 people is really expensive. I remember we used to have letter stuffing parties at Stephen's house, where we just sat around a table all doing our little bit in a production line.
God, the past sounds like such bullshit.
It was I feel like saying, particularly to young people, you just do not know what it was like in those days.
I mean, I was like 7 at that point, so I know roughly what it was like. But yeah, now's better for this. Now is so much better for this.
And I felt that, just imagine if we had an email list, and that was as far as I was thinking. But also, the things that had really fired me up and started me on the road to being an activist were the things I learned in that Council of Europe conference in Amsterdam in 1993. I discovered there was a whole load of law and medicine, and there were activists all over Europe and coming in from America as well, even Australia. There was an awful lot more to this than my little parochial view had ever entertained. And I came away from that. I describe it in one of my books as a sort of Damascene moment, because suddenly I thought, wow, if this stuff has really changed my outlook on what we can do, just imagine if I could communicate this, or anybody could communicate this to everybody else. So I thought, again, we can't send it out to everybody. On paper, it would cost us a fortune. But, supposing we had a website, and at the time, the internet provider that I was using had just produced, just experimentally started to offer that people could have their own home pages. And so I swiftly learned how to do HTML and how to set up a page, and everything had to be manufactured. We had no scanners in those days. I needed a version of the Press for Change logo, so I had to draw it in the little drawing package that came with the very first version of Microsoft Word. And there were no photos. So I took some selfies, and I got other people's photos, and I went down to a little graphics company in the village and said, could you do me a favor? Could you scan these for me? And it was sort of piecing it together. And also, okay, we can do this, but when you've got web pages, now what are you going to do with them? Because people will visit once maybe, oh, that's very interesting, and then they'll never come back. So what will drive people to keep coming back? What can we do to raise the consciousness of people?
Yeah, because Google did not exist at this point. Google wouldn't be coming in for like another 4 or 5 years. Like you had things like Yahoo.
And Yahoo and
Alta Vista was my search engine of choice when I was first on the internet. Looking at Pokemon cheat codes.
I remember the day that somebody told me about this new one called Google, and I thought, oh God, this is another one I have to. And my whole technology career is littered with making bad calls about new technology. So yeah, my colleagues were very skeptical. They said, well, this is all right for you, Christine, because you're in the business. You have to, your computers are owned by your company, but they're very expensive. And as luck would have it, that was the time that Amstrad brought out the PC 1512, and suddenly, everybody could have a PC for, I think it was 300 quid. Even that, of course, in today's money is a huge amount of money, but it's sort of, and I just began to build the idea that if I built it, people would come. If the offer was compelling enough, then for trans people starved of information anywhere else, there would be a reason to get online and get this stuff. And then a new volunteer came along for Press for Change in about 95, called Claire McNabb. She was a former lobbyist for the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And she was keen to get involved because she was very technical. And we sort of split the job, because I said, okay, I'll do the writing, you do the web formatting. And she had grand ideas about how we could set up email list servers. So I said, yeah, let's do that. And we were going to have 2 list servers, one dedicated simply to pushing out news to people, and only a handful of us would have the posting rights to that. And then we also set up one for people to discuss the news as well. So we launched those on the world in 1996, at just the time that we had won a really important case in the European Court of Justice. Now, to explain that, because this is the beginning of a next leap in our development as a campaign, you have to go back to 1993. And another activist who was only sort of peripherally involved with Press for Change, but she had been a training manager for the council in Cornwall, and she'd been very successful and she was much admired, and she had just had an appraisal with her boss, and she said, look, since we're having this conversation, I need to tell you that I plan to transition. And sort of what's that mean? So she explained, and she went from having being given a pay rise and having compliments showered on her, to by the end of the afternoon being escorted off the premises by security with a cardboard box with her belongings. And again, a bit like Mark Reese, she wasn't going to take that lying down. She got some support from Liberty, but also importantly from the Equal Opportunities Commission, which was, of course, in those days, long before the Equality and Human Rights Commission. It was the statutory body that dealt with the Sex Discrimination Act. And with support from those sides and some support from us as well, she took this case to an employee tribunal. Well, actually, in those days, they were called industrial tribunals. And her argument was that that what had happened to her was sex discrimination.
Under the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act.
That's right. And in fact, originally, when the Sex Discrimination Act was enacted in 1975, the original intention had been that trans people should be covered by it.
Trans people have a sex, so it would make sense.
That's right. Yes, but and the point was that the Sex Discrimination Act, contrary to what some people like to believe, isn't an act of parliament just for women's discrimination. It's not hard-won rights by women. It's actually about discrimination taking place for members of either sex on the basis of that sex.
Yeah, I've read the act, and it was very clear. It's very specific on that point. Like, I mean, it's kind of reminded me in the States, there's a whole thing about like the sex discriminations in the Civil Rights Act. That's kind of got the same concept behind it. If you discriminate someone because of what you assume their sex is, that comes under the Act, so it makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, whenever you get these cases, they all turn on the same thing, that discriminating against a trans person can only take place because of all the baggage that goes around about having a sex. And therefore, if you're if you are discriminated against for planning to transition or transitioning, then that is as much sex discrimination as any other form. So she took the case to appeal, and the appeal tribunal said, "Look, this is above our pay grade. We need to get some input from the European Court of Justice, because the idea of her treatment fell under the Equal Treatment Directive, which was imported into British law as a result of us joining the common market in 1972. And so it went to the European Court of Justice, which isn't the same as the European Court of Human Rights. I think even quite senior members of government seem to get these two mixed up. And they looked at it and they said, as you've just said, this is sex discrimination. So the case came back to Britain, and therefore, as a result, not only all the trans people in Britain, but all the trans people who across Europe also gained this protection against sex discrimination wherever their countries already had a sex discrimination act.
And this is the P versus
S. There was P versus S and Cornwall County Council. So there were two respondents. One was her direct manager, and the other was the county council employing her, because they were both part and parcel to this discrimination.
See, I was just about to go like, "Gosh darn you, S, why are you such a dick?" But then I was just thinking, actually, what they did, whoever they are, maybe it shouldn't have been this way, but what they did kind of opened things up for trans people all over Europe.
Yeah.
Well, this is so often the case, actually, that progress relies on people being dicks and being caught out in their dickishness by courts, because without this seed material of a discrimination or an injustice, then you don't have the reason to go to court to make the bigger point. And for us, it sort of put us on the map because we were associated with this, but also we were just reaching the point of being able to communicate and say, we are the lobby for trans people, and to be the expert heads to go on the media to talk about it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, this definitely led to an acceleration of things, and that makes sense that you became like the name of trans lobbying. Well,
there were no other lobby groups. I mean, one of the most remarkable things is that in my book Trans Britain, I sort of confirmed to myself that there was nothing prior to 1965 or 66, which was when the Beaumont Society was formed. But the Beaumont Society was and is a support organisation. It's not a political lobby. And nobody else, because we didn't believe that there was any angle to lobby on, that we actually had about 25 years of just having support groups whose job was really to put an arm around each other and teach each other a little bit of history and about what your rights are, what to do if somebody challenges you on using the toilets or whatever. So that,
yeah, I gotta say, everyone should buy Trans Britain, because I read it at the end of last year and into this year, and this whole section is you won't be able to see this, listeners, but Christine is holding up a copy of the book. This gold stuff is kind of covered in like the part 1 section, which is titled Survival, and you've got like, I'm looking at the chapter listing now, and you've got like Is There Anyone Else Like Me, written by Christine Burns. You've got Sex, Gender, Rock and Roll, written by Kate Hutchinson, who is a friend of mine. I didn't know she was in the book, and it's like, oh, Kate's in this is awesome. But yeah, all the way through, it's just great, and I would heartily recommend it. But yeah, Christine, so when it came to like Press for Change of now, you're known amongst certain policy people, and the phone sometimes rings, they call you in, and you're sat there with a bunch of cisgender politicians, some of whom will have
we
idea.
hadn't got in the door with the politicians at that stage.
Oh, okay. So how did you get in the door?
Well, this is the next bit, because we were obviously getting to the last days of the major government around this time. And then we had a
For people very young and listening, it was a very silly time. Like, Spice Girls were a thing. There was British flags everywhere. It was ridiculous. Like, the 90s was weird. Like, don't get nostalgic. It's a weird time. Move on. But yes, continue, Christine.
Yeah. 1997, Labour won the general election. And we thought, oh, well, this is going to be interesting, because they'd actually been sort of lukewarm and supportive of our goals. And it turned out, actually, a little bit later, I found out that the Conservatives, for all of their awfulness, had actually been doing quite a lot of work behind the scenes. But I'll come back to that in a moment. So the really important thing about our progress is that it wasn't partisan. Members of both sides of the House actually supported us having, basic rights like not being summarily sacked without any redress, and having to carry around a government document that instantly outed us. But what actually happened as a result of Labour coming to power was, after about 6 months, one of the ministers at the Department for Education and Employment got in touch with us and said, there's been this case. We're not happy that it just rests as being case law from the European Court of Justice. We want to incorporate this into the Sex Discrimination Act properly by making new regulations. And so we thought, oh, this is good. We'll probably have a consultation and so on. Anyway, there was radio silence until the following spring, when all of a sudden, and I remember this clearly, a consultation document dropped on us very late. And it was absolutely dreadful. I remember Stephen ringing me up at work and said, this thing's arrived in the post and it's absolutely awful. And so I cut my afternoon short, got in the car, drove around, met him outside the college where he worked. He just photocopied the consultation document. It was warm when I took it in through the window of the car. I drove home, I scanned it, I OCR'd it, I got it into a readable form. And by late that evening, we'd actually got it up onto the website and into this, this email server that we'd just set up as well. And I remember writing the email to everybody saying, look, this has happened. We need to respond to this because it's absolutely true. But what it was suggesting was, should there be exceptions to the principle of it being unlawful to discriminate against a transsexual, supposing it's dealing with vulnerable people. And what they meant there was children, old people, and a lot of trans people even then worked in social care. It could end people's employment, but it goes deeper than that. There were a whole load of these sort of rather unpleasant suggestions. And I said to people, I'm not going to tell you what to write, because if you all say the same thing, they will receive this and say, oh, it's a campaign, and dismiss it. But if you all write in your own terms, and preferably go and see your MP, talk to them about this, then it's that much more legitimate. We're not telling you, we're just telling you that there's this opportunity. We're not telling you what to say. And we learned a few weeks later, at this time, there had been no government public consultations ever before. The Conservatives didn't do that. You don't ask the hoi polloi how to govern. This was a bright new idea from Labour about asking the people, and they had no sort of experience in how to go about this. And in came this avalanche of responses to this consultation, and it just knocked them off the rails. They had been anticipating that they'd have this little consultation, and then they'd dump regulations on Parliament in a form that they don't get debated, they just get enacted a few days later, and that would be done. It was just a simple thing. And along came 300 of us, I gather, slightly over 300, saying, whoa, this is awful. And it wasn't just trans people, it was friends of trans people, it was professionals, it was all sorts of figures. And because they hadn't planned for this, it completely wrecked their plan. And in fact, they didn't get back onto the rails with this plan to modify the Sex Discrimination Act for a full 12 months. We'd done that much damage. And towards the end of this, I remember getting invited to go and meet Margaret Hodge, who was the Minister for Education and Employment, in her office. And it was wonderful. I was working for an international consultancy in those days, and I spent a lot of time in London. And this was incredibly convenient, given that otherwise I was well out of the way in Manchester. And so I said to my boss, I'm just going to take a slightly longer lunchtime. He said, oh, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to talk to the Minister for Education and Employment. Oh, okay. So,
I mean, there's not much that they could say to be like, actually, we need you to keep it short. We've got so lot on. You're just like, okay, off you go.
Yeah. So I went to this meeting with the original P from P versus S as well, and an MP, Lynn Jones, who was a Labour MP, so on the same side as Margaret Hodge. And although I think my colleagues were planning to be a bit fairly clubbable, I was taking no prisoners. I thought this is a one-off opportunity. So let's say it was robust. And I remember leaving her office and looking back. And if you look at the way that Margaret Hodge is regarded these days as being quite a pugilistic, barnstorming senior MP, she was sort of resting back on her desk, looking absolutely exhausted. But I think we sort of got the message through. And so a lot of the things we wanted to change got into the legislation. We didn't get everything we wanted. And in fact, we were arguing that it was a mistake to legislate. We were quite happy that we'd got the case law, because any actual examples of discrimination that came up, the courts were already interpreting this win in the European Court of Justice. They didn't need to have it spelled out in additions to the Sex Discrimination Act. But government doesn't like leaving things to chance, and so they did insist on legislating, and that's where we got all that wording. This was in 1999 about planning to undergoing or having undergone gender reassignment, and unfortunately at that time, in the absence of anything else, that was defined medically. But it was a big move for us, because we'd not only won an international court case, but we'd also forced the government to do something. And going down in the lift with the private secretary of the minister, said, we really want to talk to other departments about the rest of the issues that we've got, and we don't know how to reach them, because even in 1999. Government departments were only just getting email. I managed to work out what the email address of particular figures in the Home Office should be, because there was a format for their email addresses, but it was very hit and miss. So that event, the fact that we'd not only got legal protection from workplace discrimination in 1999, it also opened the door to us saying to senior figures in both political and the civil service, look, we're people who you can talk to us. We're professionals. I give advice to blue chip companies about tens of millions of pounds of IT investment. You can talk to us. And that's actually what got us on the road to then being inside the door. So, that made an enormous difference to us, because we were being listened to. But even then, we were still up against the fact that Tony Blair's government, was in no hurry to legislate for the big thing, legal recognition, or at least what we were looking for was a means for people to be able to change their birth certificate. And we wanted to do that because it was a matter of privacy. that if you always were compelled to carry around this document that it instantly outed you, and there was an awful lot of places which demanded to see your birth certificate, particularly if you wanted to go and work in government, for instance, that it was a really serious problem. But if we had no
and this is where the Gender Recognition Act kind of started to become a concept.
Well, it became sort of. And in parallel with this, I'd also exploited an opportunity to get somebody in with the producers of Coronation Street in 1997. It was all kicking off in 1996 and 97. The producers,
kind of like the 2014 to 16 of recently,
yes,
1997.
Yeah, these things, it's like buses, they all come along at once. And so they had started with this character called Hayley Patterson, and they hadn't really thought through. She was lifted really initially straight off the tabloid papers. And again, I used this brand new lobbying tool to motivate lots of people to write to Granada or ring them up and say, you're misrepresenting us. And within a couple of days, I had a phone call from one of the storyliners who said, can we talk? And I remember I had a long chat with him on the fire escape of one of my employer's offices. They were very forgiving of the amount of time I spent doing something other than computer consultancy. But I recognized that I wasn't going to have the time to do this. And one of the people who had stood out in terms of getting onto Granada had been a young activist called Annie Wallace, who was actually working in a branch of PC World at the time as a tech. And
Annie Wallace of Hollyoaks today. She has been on the pod. She's cool. We like her. Yeah.
I'm sure she's now by now told this story that I introduced her to Granada, and she got in there and she wrote an entire backstory for Hayley. She also became really good friends with Julie Hessenhaus, who played Hayley, and also became a hit with the other, or the other actors at Coronation Street. And that's what led to her deciding to go for her dream, because she'd always wanted to be in acting, not working in a PC world. And so she moved from where she was living in Scotland, came to live quite close to here in Manchester, then went to acting school, and the rest, as they say, is history. But
she also has a chapter in Trans Britain where she talks about this.
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, Trans Britain is basically going through my address book, if you realise. Because what Annie was able to do was to plot a long-term course for Hayley, and the people at Coronation Street were absolutely determined they wanted Hayley to marry Roy. And she had to explain to them, well, that's the crux. We can't do that. And so they made that the story. And when the plot got to the point in 1999 that they had this blessing for their marriage in Roy's roles, that actually forced the Home Secretary of the day to actually make a statement. This was Jack Straw saying, look, we're going to look into this. We're going to set up a working group involving all the government departments to see.
And that came from watching Corrie.
Yeah.
Which back in the 90s, for people like younger who may not be aware, there was 4 channels, maybe 5. Channel 5 might have been at that point, I don't know. But there was like 4 or 5 channels, which meant that out of like 60 million of people,
18 million people watched that wedding.
Yeah.
Blessing. And
so I could see how that would have an effect on a political scale, which may not be possible now. So if EastEnders had a trans character that was really suffering because they were non-binary and couldn't get legal recognition for some reason, It probably wouldn't have the same effect today, but back then I could see that it would have a huge effect.
I mean, these big set pieces, because I remember, the Den and Angie's divorce on Christmas Day in EastEnders, that was 20
A
million
cultural
or so.
moment.
That's right.
I remember that. I remember that as a cultural moment, even though I was like barely a human being at that point. Like the soap operas in the 90s and 80s and 90s were cultural moments.
They were big business.
In a way they aren't now.
There was the lesbian kiss on Brookside.
On Brookside, yeah.
There was Michael Cashman's kiss with his boyfriend on EastEnders. They actually tried to outdo each other in terms of pushing the envelope. But these were really important ways of getting a message across. So, although it's just a soap opera, it was an incredibly potent weapon. But actually the backstory to this, and I only learned this later, was that when they set up this working group involving 12 departments, the groundwork had already been done, because we'd received a leak hold on to your seat here, a few years earlier, we'd received a leak from the Daily Mail, who actually had learned that somebody in the Cabinet Office in John Major's government had been tasked with actually saying who would lead on such a thing. So all the work was actually thought through.
And the Daily Mail helped you out.
Yeah.
I've just been looking at a Daily Mail thing that they did, and that's not the case now. Like now, they kind of want us to be banned from places, but I can't believe what I'm hearing.
Well, it wasn't usually the case then either, but I think this was a case that the journalist in question, wanted to get a reaction from us because this thing had been leaked to them. And Stephen Whittle very sensibly said, well, I can't comment on something I've not seen. Send it to me. And he sent it on to me as well. So we actually had this evidence from inside government that they were actually planning to if we had to do this, how would we do it? So maybe all the letters and all the cornering ministers with smoked salmon sandwiches, all these things add up. And so this is why I say it's actually not about a particular party being responsible for our moves forward. It's actually there was support for the idea right across the spectrum, with the sole exception, of course, of the DUP.
Gotta love the DUP.
Yeah, so you gotta love them, really.
They're at least consistent.
Because no one else will. So that is part one of our interview with Christine Burns. Cutting in quite abruptly there. That is going to continue next week, where she goes into how the Haley Cropper effect, amongst other things, kind of spurred the government sort of into looking at what was known then as transsexual rights. Ashley, what's your take on what we've heard so far?
So one of the things that I really like about a conversation with Christine Burns is that it's a fantastic history lesson, frankly, and there's so many elements of it which you might have heard of or be aware of the generals of, but she knows the specifics because she was there and has done the research to, augment her memory and, spoken to the people that were there on the ground and was involved with them. So it's always so illuminating. And as we said at the start of the episode, we wanted to have, we had an hour's chat in the diary, but it ended up being 2, which is why we've split this out. But yeah, it's just always so interesting.
It was so much fun to talk to her as well. I think that was one of the issues. It was just so fun to just.
I'll definitely use a tray of salmon sandwiches as a weapon next time I'm at an event like that, cornering somebody with a tray of salmon sandwiches. Although, I mean, most of the events now it'll probably be a tray of vegetarian canapes, which is fine.
Yeah,
so yeah,
delicious. But yeah, I would say one lesson to take from the Christine Burns interview is if you are of the younger generation, definitely seek out people who were there before, because not only do you get this sense of history that you are not a unique outlier in history that is trying to fight for something new, that you are part of a long chain of people who have been fighting for trans equality going back decades and generations. And I mean, Christine Burns isn't done. Like, she's still out there, taking more of a backseat role these days, but basically trying to do her bit by boosting certain things on social media, but do seek her out online and do read her book. I've read Trans Britain, as I said in the interview. I've read that, and I think it made me better at doing this. I think it should be considered mandatory reading, and I would definitely be checking out her other books too. So you can find information on all of that in the episode description as per usual, and also you can check out the second half of our chat next week.
Yes, indeedy. But for now, I think that's quite enough for this episode. So for now, we will sign off. We will speak to you next week, but if you need to get hold of us in the meantime, of course, you can find us on Facebook /WhatTheTrans, Twitter, we're @WhatTheTrans. We have a blog these days at whatthetrans.medium.com, and we also have a shiny website, which is, of course, whatthetrans.com.
Yeah, come and say hello to us. Although at the moment we're kind of locked out of Twitter for reasons that I don't understand, but I'm fixing that today. So yeah, reach out, give us a message and tell us how you're doing. And until then, speak to you soon, or you'll be able to listen to us soon on this. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Stay safe. We love you. This episode of What the Trans was produced by Michelle Snow and Ashley Talbot and was edited by Michelle Snow. We would like to give special thanks to our Patreon-level producers who are The Cthulhu Kid,
Kai Passon,
Helen,
Mallory Moore,
Chrissy Jarvis,
Stuart Gay, Gray,
Nick Ross,
Alice Chalkley,
Jasmine,
Sim,
Melody Nix,
Zoe Laura Mayer,
Fiona Punchard,
John,
Lynn Mackay,
Nick Duffy,
CB Bailey,
Gordon Cameron,
Peter Kimball,
Rachel T.S.,
Wen Riverup,
Vic Parsons,
Tila Wild,
Atom James,
Vanessa Billington,
Tower Watch,
Rowan Littlejones,
Desiree Markland,
Samantha Raven,
Patreon user So Mysterious,
Derek Victor,
Sarah Bedful of Dogs Halliwell,
Emma Doyle,
Mike Dickinson,
Owen Willis,
Catherine,
Mina,
Elliot McVeigh,
Cassius Adair,
Tuck,
Melissa Brooks,
Ian Cumber,
Maddie Bell,
Karakan 12,
April Heller,
Sophie Lewis,
Alexandra Lilly,
Claire Scott,
Ariadne Pena,
Lauren O'Nions,
Mara Reynolds,
Bernard's Pink Jelly Bean,
Lanos,
and Chris Hubley. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye!